Thanks for listening to the Mornings with Carmen LaBerge podcast, made available thanks to support from listeners just like you.
Helping you wake up, remembering this is our Father's world. This is Mornings with Carmen LaBerge on Faith Radio.
If we're gonna fly, we fly like eagles, arms held wide. If we're gonna fear, we fear no evil. We will rise. By your power we will go. By your spirit we are bold. If we're gonna stand, we stand as giants. If we're gonna walk, we walk as lions.
Okay, not quite Mornings with Carmen. No, I'm Paul, usually the producer, but this week, with Carmen on vacation, I'll be filling in. So mornings without Carmen here on Faith Radio. Thank you, Ryan, for stepping in and doing the producer-type stuff.
You got it. I'm no Paul Perot, but I'll do my best.
Well, that's probably a benefit. Hey, question, since your mic is on. When you were a kid, did you have a stuffed animal, a teddy bear, maybe a stuffed football that, you're a sports guy, stuffed football that you held close?
Yes, I had all those things, I believe, yeah.
Okay. Maybe, how about you? Did you have a teddy bear or other stuffed animal that you held on for security when you were little? I'm okay to read about that. You can let me know on the text line, 877-933-2484. Yeah, having something you didn't let go of, especially when you are scared. It's nice having something you can hold on to, something you can touch that's tactile. The tactile experience can be so soothing. Yes, as we grow up, we give up the teddy bears that we carry, but that doesn't mean we outgrow our desire for security, for comfort, our need for something to hold on to in a world that is broken and scary. So we want something that will bring us comfort, maybe even to some degree a sense of control in a situation. So what things are you holding on to today as an adult that you feel give you comfort or even control? There's a lot of things that we could use like that teddy bear. Maybe we seek it by being part of a certain tribe, a theological tribe. I'm a Baptist. No, I'm a Presbyterian. Or a political tribe, be it Republican, Democrat, or other, a social tribe. Oh, how about an entertainment tribe? Maybe you're more of a Star Wars person as opposed to a Star Trek person, something like that. Or we can seek it through sex or sexual expression. Or we can find it through things like wealth, through our money. Our Growing Your Faith verse for today is Hebrews 13, 5 through 6. Do not love money, but be satisfied with what you have. For God has said, I will never leave you. I will never abandon you. So you can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, so I have no fear. What can a mere person do to me? Now, this is in the last chapter of Hebrews. The writer here is laying out a long string of final exhortations and encouragement after he spent so much time in the letter laying out the importance and the supremacy of Jesus, his person, his saving work, and our response in faith to him over all the so-called religious things we could do to save ourselves and put ourselves right with God. You know, things we can hold on to if you wish. So as he's closing out the letter with this rapid-fire list of exhortations and encouragements, he deals with many things: loving others well and showing hospitality, keeping sex within God design, and an exhortation about our view of money. Money. It opens doors, doesn't it? You can buy the things you want. You can accumulate it as a hedge against problems or fears of the future. You can wield it in so many ways, but it can also corrupt the heart. And the writer wants to spare you from that, and he offers something better. Now, he draws his Hebrew readers, it is the letter to the Hebrews, right? He's drawing them to a key promise back that Israel heard when they were about to cross into the promised land. As Moses was preparing to die and hand over the reins to Joshua, Moses would not be going before them into the Holy Land. And there was fear and dismay. In Deuteronomy 31, as Moses is talking first with the people, he told them, be strong and courageous, do not fear or be in dread of the Canaanites, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Then he turns to Joshua, the new leader, and says, it is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear. Do not be dismayed. And as if Moses' words weren't enough, flip over into the first chapter of Joshua. After Moses had passed, and Joshua might have been feeling weak and afraid, God came to him personally. And what does he say? Just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. And I will never leave you or forsake you. God offered to Joshua something he wanted from the very beginning with Adam and Eve, really. He wanted, he created us in his image. He wanted a relationship with us. One that, think about that. Having a relationship with their creator, the one who's all-powerful and loving. Okay, let's go forward as we go back to what we're talking about in our book of Hebrews chapter 13, our Growing Your Faith verse. After all that the writer has shown through the book about all that Jesus is and all that he accomplished on our behalf, the writer calls us to live in light of that. And our verse today, well, it has to do with the issue of money, but goes beyond that. Again, do not love money, but be satisfied with what you have. What do you have? Okay, you may be thinking, well, I have my meager possessions. I can be satisfied with that, but that's not all. That's not all they had. They had God. That's where he brings in that promise again, that God will never leave you or forsake you. You have God himself. In light of that, money, sex, social status, our tribes, they should all end up in a proper place, not at the center of our heart, our affections, our security. That's where God belongs, which leads us to that confidence as the verse continues. The Lord is my helper, so I will have no fear. What can mere people do to me? I hope you're resting in that truth. Let that, again, that promise, I will never leave you or forsake you, just echo in your mind this morning. Well, again, this is Mornings, again, without Carmen. I'm Paul filling in. And, my wife and I like to go on drives. And recently we did some drives to some of the small towns in southern Minnesota. And it's interesting, one of the things that stand out is the architecture of these old buildings, these old stately county and city office buildings with their Gothic or colonial or classical designs, the shops and the churches that speak to the ethnicity of the Europeans who settled in these areas many years ago. It speaks of their heritage. It speaks in many ways of the things they valued. You see it in their buildings and the designs. So do we not see the same when we look at the beauty, the designs, the intricacies of nature? Do we not see something of God when we do that? Now, we've talked many times here on Mornings with Carmen with people like Cy Gart, who has a book about science and the harmony of faith. We've talked with people, and we will again today, Dr. Linda Mintle. She's a psychologist, but she sees not just God's design for our human makeup, but glimpses into God himself. So how do we understand the world around us, God's creation? And how does that help us see God better and understand the Bible better? Joel Carini, who blogs as The Natural Theologian, joins me in 90 seconds. Thanks again for listening to Faith Radio and Mornings with Carmen. Well, again, thank you for listening to Mornings with Carmen on this Monday. Carmen is out. I'm Paul, so I guess it's Mornings without Carmen. As we try to help you bring the mind of Christ to the matters of the day, to what's happening in the world around us, what's happening in your life, this brings up, what do we mean by putting on the mind of Christ? How do we do that? For that, we need revelation. But how has God revealed himself? Now, as theologically conservative Christians, we'll say, yeah, the God speaks through the Bible. But does he only speak through the Bible? Joining us now is Joel Carini, who you're currently, Joel, working on your PhD in philosophy at St. Louis University, but you're also this blogger at Substack. That's where I found you, The Natural Theologian. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Paul.
Okay. Natural theologian. We need to start there, because what do you mean? Because there's been a lot of people who say what natural theology is. For you, what do you understand when it comes to natural theology? Because you're also a theologian as well, biblical theologian. So how do you balance those? What does it mean to be a natural theologian?
Yes. So the Christian tradition has really taught that God has revealed himself both in special revelation in the Bible, specific words telling us a message, but also in general or natural revelation through through nature, which one theologian even called the book of nature, a second book that God has written for us. And I think that's very important because there's a lot of information that God expects the message he's giving us to us, he expects us already to have. For example, when he tells us that we can be saved from sin through Christ, that assumes that we already have some sense that we are accountable to God just by nature. That's why the Bible talks about a law written on our heart.
Hmm.
That even if you're not a Christian, even if you haven't read the Bible, you have accountability to the moral law of God. And the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of creation, these are all revealed in nature. And when we treat them as if they're only available in the Bible, we lose an important point of contact with people who are not Christian, our neighbors and our friends, who we can communicate with them on the basis of this information that's outside of the Bible. That can be a starting point for our conversations. I don't think we want to miss that.
That is good. And okay, then people will ask, okay, is there biblical precedent to say this?
Hmm. Well, I think there is. I mean, so there's the book of Romans, very clearly speaks about how God's nature and his invisible attributes are revealed in the things that have been made. You know, it follows up with that people are suppressing these things in unrighteousness, but you can only suppress a beach ball if you know where that beach ball is on and under the water. So we're not utterly unaware of God's nature and his invisible attributes, even as the people that are doing all the sins that Romans 1 describes. I mean, it's also there in Psalm 8 about the nature and the heavens revealing the glory of God. And so it's something we don't want to miss in scriptural revelation, not to mention what I mentioned about the work of the law being written on our hearts, which is described in Romans 2. I also think Jesus in his parables and lots of his speeches, he's appealing to natural phenomena. He's appealing to agriculture. He's appealing to how the world works. He says, doesn't God care for the flowers? He dresses them well. Why do we bother so much time shopping for clothes? Well, he's appealing to nature as already revealing to us these truths. So I think there's very much biblical precedent for that.
Well, do you see? I was also thinking of Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. It's another one of the verses that kind of jumps out at me. So, well, the Bible's calling us to see God in what he's made. But now we come to the question then is, do you see, okay, what's the problem humans have though? I mean, whether it be natural revelation or even special revelation, Bible, we have a problem.
Yes. So the problem is clearly sin. We've fallen from our original, the way that God made us. In a sense, we've fallen away from our true nature, but we remain human. We are still in the image of God. You know what the Bible describes about how God made us. We didn't somehow shrink down to the level of bugs or rocks or something. We are still human. We're still accountable. And in fact, we couldn't be called sinners if we didn't retain this kind of humanity and the ability to think and understand and be sensitive to the moral law. And so we're in this position where we now have what I would call an unnatural nature. Our nature is twisted and broken by the fall. The Westminster Confession of Faith asks, what's the estate into which the fall brought mankind? And it says, an estate of sin and misery, all the effects of the fall that we didn't choose and the suffering that we undergo and the way, for example, I'm a father of three and sometimes having kids in the house can be difficult. Okay, well, this suffering is part of the structure, the fabric of existence, as great a gift as children are, or other forms of suffering, we stub our toe at. Well, on one interpretation, Adam wouldn't have had these sufferings of life at least. And so, yeah, we are in this position where things aren't as they're supposed to be. Our will is twisted, and this means that we want to suppress that information that's revealed about God and nature, but we also, even when we know it clearly, we want to depart from it. We sense clearly that killing or stealing is wrong, and yet we find ways around that, and we engage in sin. So the information is revealed in the things that has been made about God's nature and his moral law. and yet we depart from it. And that really is the essence of sin.
Okay, again, we're talking with Joel Carini, who's the natural theologian. If you want to check him out, you just need to go to Substacks, look either for Joel Carini, .substack.com. I oftentimes say Substacks. It's Substack. It's singular. But anyway, there's that. Or just look up, when you're their natural theologian, and you'll find Joel there. Boy, Joel, you kind of jumped us into the next conversation I want to have, because you brought up that line from one of the catechisms about into what state did the fall bring mankind? He brought mankind into a state of sin and misery. And that's those two categories, sin and misery, are important distinctions, and I think we blur them. We see that in the modern day when, we just entered Pride Month, and there are people who struggle with their sexual identity, and they can say, well, I had this desire. Well, is the desire itself the sin, or is it the action that may come from? Anyway, we need to hopefully make that distinction. And I'm hoping you can help us, because it's not just in the area of the sexuality. This comes up in so many areas of our life, as you just kind of pointed out. But we want to talk about that next as we continue with Joel Carini, the natural theologian, my guest this morning here on Faith Radio.
Thanks so much for listening to the podcast of Mornings with Carmen. As you know, this is a rebroadcast of the live radio show we do on the Faith Radio Network every day. There is a lot going on at Faith Radio. Tons of free resources waiting for you to take advantage of and share with others at myfaithradio.com. Be sure to check us out on social media as well. This is a community of believers, and we gather together here, and we all need prayer. And, well, we'd love to pray for you. The Faith Radio team is serious about prayer. We pray for specific requests every single week when we gather on Tuesdays and Thursdays as a staff. So share your prayer request with us anonymously and securely on our website at myfaithradio.com, and then be assured of our prayers for you in the Spirit of Christ. Check it all out at myfaithradio.com.
So your kid comes down with a bad flu or something like that. What is one of the first things you do? Well, hopefully you're praying for him, yes, but what is one of the first things you say to your child? Do you say to them, repent of your sickness and turn from your sicky ways? That doesn't sound right, does it? You'd probably, if it's something severe, you'd probably ask the doctor for help. You turn to that, right? When people have, again, this is part of the fall. This is part of our brokenness. I'm Paul, by the way, filling in for Carmen here on Faith Radio. It's part of the fall. It's part of the misery we're in. So how do we deal with misery of the fall well and graciously? And that's where I'm hoping, you're not a pastor yet, are you, Joel?
Nope.
Are you
ever student right now?
Just a student. Are you ever planning on that?
Probably professor. We'll see.
Okay. Well, that's kind of a shepherding thing too, so that's okay. We'll go there. Anyway, Joel Carini, the natural theologian, joining us and looking at, again, our creation. All of creation fell into the state of fallenness because of man's sin, which brought sin and misery. Help us to make the distinction between them, because I think we do blur it many times in our modern day.
Yeah, so there's an important distinction between what we do and what happens to us. The hand of cards we're dealt versus how we play our cards. We can think about sort of what Adam was given before the fall. Everything that theologians call original sin, these twisted and broken desires, those would not have been there for Adam. He didn't already have a nature that was broken and messed up, and yet he was still able to fall. The snake still tempted Eve and Adam. But what really confuses us, it's clear, for example, the fact that we can get sick with a flu, as you described, is part of the misery and the suffering. People aren't sinners for that. But on the other hand, what we do is clearly sin. We can resist, we can choose to depart from God's teaching about how we ought to live our lives in any arena of life. I think where we get confused is when it comes to our minds, because there's aspects of our thoughts that seem to be, they're connected to our heart, they're deep within us, and yet we don't choose everything that goes on in our hearts. There's a lot that's beyond our control. Even, the ancient Greek philosophers talked about the passions, and these kind of come upon us when we get a rush of anger and we start acting in ways that we wouldn't have really chosen. Well, we have a will and we have a choice of how to behave now that we are angry, for instance, or the moments before we got angry. But the anger itself, that anger or lust or whatever the strong desire and impulse is, that's built into us. And it doesn't help us if we start, blaming ourselves for having the impulse in the first place. God has given us those impulses. They're now twisted by the fall in certain ways. And yet that's kind of the situation we're born into, is we don't get to make choices in a vacuum. We get to make choices with our desires as they are.
Broken desires. So as you would say, and as I teased just a little while ago, I mean, we have a lot of things in this world. Say a guy has a desire to view porn. Now, it's a wrong desire. It's also kind of part of the broken will or broken heart that he has, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
So how do you? Where does, I guess I maybe want to say, where's the line, if you want to say? Where's the misery aspect, and where does it become sin?
Yeah, well, I've been looking back at Jesus' words about lust, and he says that anyone who looks at a woman intending to lust after her is committing adultery in his heart. And what Jesus includes there is intention. As anyone who intends to. And I think what we sometimes do is we say anyone who has any desire in their heart, especially the ones around sex, that this is already sin, and we've got to sort of tamp that down. But there's an impulse that's natural to man. C.S. Lewis talked about the different piano keys, and there's a time for even the violent piano keys in war or to save a friend. There's a time for the sexual piano key in marriage, for instance. There's a time for standing up for someone in an almost angry way in a tense situation, and so on. These piano keys all have their place, but they've gone astray. They don't get played when they ought to. And so that's really where but the blame and the sin comes with our intention and our will. We can give in to that flicker of temptation and desire. We can feed it, and then desire grows. But now our will has already gotten involved. We're choosing to go deeper down that path.
So it's again the intentionality issue. With when you choose to say, "Okay, I know this is wrong," or "Here's my desire," and then through both creation, because you're the natural theologian, you can look at creation, look at God's design, but also look at what God commands. And okay, here's another interesting discussion at some time. How much of God's moral law is built in, is kind of baked into the design, because I kind of see that. But that's another discussion. But okay, where was I going with that? I just derailed myself, Joel. But again, go ahead.
The same-sex attraction issue, perhaps? Because that's where, especially, as the world is celebrating a Pride Month, I think it's really important that we look at people who experience, let's say, sexual temptation in a different direction than the majority, in a way that is sympathetic. I mean, I've especially been talking to Christians who experience same-sex attraction, and they did not, sign up for this.
No.
This is something they, through a lot of pain, realized, the temptations that their youth group leader said they were going to be experiencing. They weren't experiencing those ones, but a different set. And they didn't choose that. But now they have to live according to Christians in a way that's always going to be difficult in certain ways. It's going to require saying no to their nature. And so I'm very motivated to see that we Christians don't put everything in the category of sin, especially the things that people don't choose, even in the arena of sexual temptation and desire.
Yeah. Actually, I remember, this goes many years ago. Now, I grew up in the Catholic tradition, and we're going through a class for, we had what was religion release in those days, which we've talked about here on Mornings with Carmen before. But we would have these, we had a sex ed course for 1 year. And when it came to homosexuality, even back then, this is back in the 70s, early 80s when I was going through this, and they said, okay, having the desire or having that in you, that's not the sin. That's something that you need to recognize, and it leads to the wrong direction. It's outside God's design. But acting upon it, that's where the sin is. So
that's helpful and encouraging. I think, that the theological category of original sin blurs this boundary a little bit. It refers to the twisted, broken desires themselves, and yet that's different from the actual sins that we commit. So we want to keep this distinction, but I do think Christians have been tempted even since the 70s to, whether purposefully or not, to treat this sin as particularly shameful, as what I think it is, which is particularly deserving of sympathy. Because as C.S. Lewis said, this is one of the only sins to which he was never tempted. Okay, well, does C.S. Lewis get brownie points in heaven for not having any homosexual temptations? No. And does the person get blame who doesn't have any straight temptations, but only the homosexual ones? No, this is part of the hand of cards that God dealt them through whatever process in his good design. And I think we need to encourage such people and lead them towards Christ without shame.
I agree. And that it's not just sexual sin, too. We can talk about, as we open the show, talking about money, the issue of greed, the issue of gluttony. The list goes on, because we all have propensities to certain things, pride or whatever. And again, these are all things we understand. We should understand they're there, deal with them with sympathy, but also hopefully pointing people to live in accordance with God. So, and His design, and finding grace in Christ too. So, hey, Joel, I want to thank you for joining me. Good conversation. Appreciate you. Again, to find Joel, just go to Substack, look for The Natural Theologian, or joelcarini.substack.com, and he's got a lot of writings there. And you keep me thinking, Joel. You keep me thinking.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, this is Mornings with Carmen, helping you apply the mind of Christ to the matters of the day, and encouraging you as well to pray the news. Now, 2024 is not just an election year here in America. About half of the world's countries that have some form of democracy or popular elections are having elections this year. As a matter of fact, history has been made in Mexico over the weekend with the election of the country's first ever female president. Claudia Sheinbaum is the former mayor of Mexico City. She'll be succeeding President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, and she pledges to govern with the same principles as Obrador did, and calling for good things for all Mexicans. By the way, she's the first Jewish person to be president of Mexico as well. Just last week, South Africa, they had their parliamentary elections, and the African National Congress, for the first time since the end of the apartheid era, did not get a majority of the votes. India, the UK, many other countries still have elections pending. And it's been interesting because I've been looking at what some of these Christians in other countries are saying about their country's elections and how they feel they should be involved. One thing that comes out is that there is a tension that many of our brothers and sisters in Christ overseas are dealing with in their countries. We feel it here. So how do we represent Christ well when we engage in this context? Dan Bennett's coming up in a bit. He's not only the blogger of Uneasy Citizenship, he's got the book out by that same name. He joins us in 3 minutes. I'm Paul, filling in for Carmen here on Faith Radio. Fight or flight? Okay, you get into a tense situation and the adrenaline starts kicking in, and okay, which is your tendency? If there's something hard or something contentious, are you one of those who shrinks back, the flight? Are you one of those who's ready to, roll up the sleeves and put up the knuckles and fight? Or is there a different way? Because the tension's there. How are you handling the tension? This is true of so many aspects of our lives, including when it comes to how we as Christians engage with, the public, especially in the area of politics. Dan Bennett's joining us again. Dan, thanks again for joining us. We enjoy our conversations. A political scientist from John Brown University. You blog at the Uneasy Citizenship blog. And now Just out, the new Uneasy Citizenship, Embracing the Tension in Faith and Politics book. How's it been going with that new book? Because it's been out, what, about a week and a half now? 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think 2 weeks ago was the unofficial release date or the official public launch. So it's been going well. We've been getting some good feedback, conversations from folks, online, but also just in my community. It's been encouraging to see and hear of people reading it and really, really thinking about it. So that, hey, as an author, that's really all you can hope for.
I love the story you share about where the title Uneasy Citizenship came. I want you to share that story because I think it really opens the doors to how we need to learn to embrace these tensions.
Yeah, so I was at this workshop for faculty sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, which is a center-right think tank out of Washington, D.C. And it was the third or fourth such workshop that I've done. It really was an opportunity to get together with other political science faculty, some economics folks, history folks as well, and hear from interesting speakers and prompt some good conversations and discussions on issues of the day. And we were in a session with a political science professor from Notre Dame named Patrick Deneen. And in the past, I guess in the last year before this session, he had written a book called Why Liberalism Failed. Why Liberalism Failed.
That's right.
And yeah, in the book, he's not talking about liberal in the context of American, political ideology. He's talking about it from the classical liberalism, philosophical tradition, from John Locke, the ideas emphasizing individual rights, free speech, private property, limited government, et cetera. And the point of the book, which ended up becoming kind of a surprise bestseller for him, which is unusual as an academic, is that our system of liberalism in the US and a lot of the other Western countries in the world has become a victim of its own success in terms of prioritizing the rights of the individual over the rights of the community, emphasizing personal identity as kind of this apex of human existence. And he's arguing a lot of the problems in our society can be traced to that prioritization of the self. And as I'm listening to Deneen, because some of his solutions take a more anti-liberal approach to say, well, we need to empower the state to enforce morality more. We need to become less comfortable with individual freedoms and individual rights, especially as people of faith who believe in the ultimate truth, who believe in the sovereignty of God over the matters of human beings. And I remember taking notes, and one of the phrases or one of the things that I wrote down, it just kind of came to me in that moment, was this term uneasy citizenship, this idea that we are citizens, and if we're taking more of a classical Christian understanding of the term, we're citizens of two kingdoms, right? We're citizens of heaven, first and foremost, but we're also citizens as people on earth. And that tension that exists inherently in how we balance these citizenships should make us not necessarily skeptical of one kind of citizenship over the other, but it should make us uncomfortable. It should make us uneasy, and it should encourage us to think carefully about the implications for these sorts of citizenship. So that was the point, or that was the beginning of this project of sorts. Was a note in a notebook at a faculty workshop.
Well, it's interesting because there's certain times a phrase comes to mind. I'm glad you wrote it down because there's many times I'll have a phrase come to mind. It's like a few days later, it's like, I wish I had written that down because I don't remember exactly what I said. Did you put any other notes with it, just kind of clarifying what you meant? But
well, yeah, I kind of jotted down the gist of what I just said. This idea that we can be essentially, and this made it into the book as well, that we can be comfortably uncomfortable with the way in which our citizenship is balanced against each other. As Christians, we are living in the already but not yet, right? We're living in the future, but we're also living in the now. When Jesus calls us to be in the world but not of the world, we hear that so many times that it might, at least for me, kind of gloss over. But if you really unpack that, if you really think about the implications for what it means to be in the world but not of the world, just like so many of the things that Jesus said, that kind of should get us to pause and say, well, what does that mean exactly? What what does that mean practically for us to be in the world and engaging with the world, but not doing things of the world? And so it was hinting at these tensions of sorts.
Yeah, one of the lines you had in one of your articles is you're hoping you get people to reconsider the ways in which Christians can do politics and doing so in a more holistic, kingdom-oriented way. Because now you're trying to bring some holism, at least in our hearts, because the world is divided. And again, because the world is fallen and Jesus came to redeem and all that, there is that tension with the world. So how do you stay holistic and kingdom-oriented with the pull, I guess, is the question, which, okay, I don't know if you're going to fully answer it, but hopefully you're pointing us, what are the directions you're pointing us to be more holistic and kingdom-oriented?
Well, and this gets into one of the chapters in the book where I talk about the role of political polarization and partisanship kind of becoming endemic in our political decision making and processes, and how this can very easily cause us to abandon a holistic approach to politics and say, well, the contemporary battles and fights of the day are of first importance, and in order to do politics well and to encourage and promote the flourishing of our communities, we first have to defeat our opponents or our enemies. We have to win. And, of course, politics is about, in many respects, trying to win temporary battles, right? There's compromise involved, but elections have winners. Votes in Congress have winners. And so obviously, I don't think Christians need to take the approach of, oh, it doesn't matter what happens in our elections. We should just be focused on on Jesus, because we're called to be in the world too. But when we do politics, we should be doing it in a way that is distinct or distinguishable from how the world does politics. Maybe this means not aligning 100% solely with a political party, or if you find yourself leaning toward a political party, looking for the blind spots in that party when it comes to the Christian faith. So if you're a Democrat, for example, or if you identify with the Democratic Party, where is that party falling short in terms of the convictions of your faith? If you find yourself aligning with the Republican Party, where is that party falling short? And not just thinking about these things, but actually holding leaders to account and asking them and pressuring them and encouraging them to see politics in a holistically Christian way, not taking the politics and the framing of our political partisanship and shaping our faith to fit that, but rather using our faith and seeing our faith as a way to shape our politics. I think too often, and I'm obviously including myself in here, Christians have a tendency to do the former rather than the latter, because it's easier and because we want to beat our opponents.
Yeah. And I guess as you're talking about this, it's like, okay, you're calling us to be prophetic. You're calling us to speak God's word into the situation. Regardless, and that includes with our friends as well as our political enemies, if you want to use that term. I don't like that, but But so we're called to something higher. It's what it sounds like.
Yeah, we're called to something higher, but ultimately, I think from just a day to day, we're called to something different. If people look at us and they can't see our salt and light when it comes to politics, I think we're doing it wrong. I think Christians should be distinguishable from the world when it comes to everything that we do, in the interactions we have in the workplace, with our families, in our communities. And if politics is an exception to that, we're 100% doing it wrong.
We can just kind of highlight that line right there. Anyway, we're talking with Dan Bennett. He's, again, a political scientist at John Brown University and host of the Uneasy Citizenship blog and his new book, Uneasy Citizenship, Embracing the Tension of Faith and Politics. And, there's been a lot of tension in our day, and a lot of organizations like, say, Harvard and others had tried to be, trying to take a political stand on things. Well, now there seems to be a backing away from that. And we're going to talk about that next with Dan as we continue here on Faith Radio.
As we consider the life of Jesus and the life of the first generation of Christians, reading here the book of Acts and all the letters to the Christians in the New Testament, We see people who wake up. They come to see and understand and then receive Jesus as their Savior and Lord. And it changes everything. We see Christians then telling other people about the good news and inviting them to respond in repentance, be baptized, and follow Jesus. The movement of Christianity grows person by person and then exponentially as people walking in darkness receive the light of Christ and want others to know what they know and have what they have. Well, you and I are living in dark days. People need light. And Jesus is the light of the world today in the same way that he was the light of the world at the beginning of creation and at the first Christmas and throughout his life on earth and in his radiance now at the right hand of the Father. Jesus is the light of the world. So if you're walking in darkness of any kind today, I invite you to consider Jesus. If you'd like to know more about what it means to begin a relationship with Christ or to chat with someone about it, just text the word faith to 41224.
Okay, no question. There's a lot of controversy, a lot of things we debate, fight over, take, bold public proclamations on, and then they come back to hurt. Hey, I'm Paul, filling in for Carmen here on Faith Radio, and Dan Bennett from the Uneasy Citizenship blog is our guest at this time. And Dan, both you and I saw the story about Harvard no longer making public comments on political or social issues. That was the headline. Basically, Harvard's interim president, along with the university officials, made this announcement this past Tuesday that the university has a responsibility to speak out to protect and promote its core function. And they must speak out on issues directly relevant to the university's operation. The university and its leaders should not, however, issue official statements about public matters that don't directly affect the university's core function. Basically, with everything that's been happening with protests, and not just the current one with the Israeli-Hamas war, but other stuff, and they're seeing that this is distracting them from their core. And also, there have been a lot of people, a lot of donors saying, will you stop it already? But anyway, what are your thoughts on this?
So there's a lot of different ways we could take this. I mean, if you want to take a more cynical view, I think you could take the donor approach to this and say, the leadership of Harvard and other universities, may have felt like they were in the clear in either endorsing or, certainly tacitly allowing some of these more extreme protests to take place and issuing statements, et cetera. But then when there's a backlash from a fairly diverse group of donors and stakeholders and alumni who are really disappointed with these public statements and actions, I think the leadership has to maybe, forced to take a step back and say, well, even if we believe these things institutionally, do we really want to take a public stance on this because of the negative effects it's causing to the brand and to our bottom line? Now, that's a cynical approach, but I do think it's worth mentioning or worth kind of digging into, the statement of saying we're not going to make comments on issues that don't directly pertain to Harvard's mission. That itself is a statement on the scope and the limits of the mission of institutions like Harvard, because there's plenty of students and faculty and alums who would say, yeah, but the Israeli-Hamas war speaks directly to the mission of Harvard in the sense of maybe not just educating students with head knowledge, but educating students to pursue justice and seek the welfare of the marginalized communities. Now, you're going to have disagreements on this, right, with people who attended Harvard or people in the community. But I'm sure there's plenty of folks who would say, well, Harvard does have a responsibility, given its platform and given its networks, to comment on some of these issues. And importantly, if you're not commenting and if you're not issuing these statements, that can be as strong as saying something, because you're essentially choosing to remain silent. So what's the takeaway here? I think it's kind of a lose-lose for Harvard. I'm not sure. So on the one hand, maybe they bring other folks back into the fold with this change in policy. But I guarantee there's just as many folks who are going to be alienated and frustrated with this decision. So I don't think it's going to satisfy people in the long run, and it shows the difficulty of having these major platforms when you're one of these elite universities.
Yeah. It was interesting as I was reading that. There was also an editorial at Christianity Today from Russell Moore where he talked about being against audience capture, and he was thinking of ministries in church. And the line that jumped out at me when I was thinking about this has to do with some fear their audiences, others their constituency, but we should fear only God. Again, we talk about the mission of what, say, an organization like Harvard or our parent organization, the University of Northwestern. We have these mission statements. But they're all under a larger mission, I would think, at least as far as ministries, fearing God, or at least serving God, fearing Him. Comment on that, because I saw a correlation.
No, I think it's 100% right, and it's really difficult to work out in practice. So I think for my institution, John Brown University, our unofficial, our slogan or our statement is head, heart, and hand, educating students with head knowledge, affecting the way that their hearts move for their communities, but also equipping them with tools to act on both of these things. Another part of our mission is Christ overall, emphasizing the primacy and sovereignty of Christ over the work that we're doing. I like the way that we frame our mission in that way, but it still leaves a lot open to interpretation, even as a ministry. So if you're a church, for example, and I think that maybe the best example of this goes back to the racial protests in 2020. If you're a pastor and you're leading the congregation, and you're seeing violence in your community, and you're seeing maybe fellow churches in the community holding marches, especially in the Black Protestant tradition, if you choose to say something, you could end up alienating or frustrating members of your congregation who see that as a political statement and saying, well, you're feeding right into the political narratives of the day, and we don't like the way you're leading our church in that way. But at the same time, if you make the conscious effort not to say something about those racial protests, there are going to be people in your congregation who see that as maybe a lack of consistency with the mission towards protecting the vulnerable, reaching out to marginalized people groups, etc.
The unity of the body.
Exactly. Yeah, especially in Christian communities. So it's not like there is a singular, holistic, right answer and approach to this. And this is why I will never be a pastor, and why we should be praying for our pastors on a daily basis. They wrestle with so many things on how to carry out the mission, not just the church, but of the larger body of Christ. And regardless of what they do, because of sin and the fallen nature of our world, people are going to be upset and disappointed. So yeah, this is really difficult to work out in practice. I'm glad I don't have to make these decisions. But leaders of these institutions and ministries should be in our prayers, not to make the decisions that align with ours, but to make the decisions that align with the Lord.
And Dan, you just brought us full circle back to embracing the tension, that uneasy citizenship thing. So it's not a fun place.
Sometimes it's organic.
Sometimes it's organic. And it's not an easy place to be. But I look at the way Christ lived his life, and he lived in that tension, and we're called to do that. Yeah. So, hey, Dan, thanks again for joining us here on Mornings with Carmen. I always appreciate our conversations.
Yeah, anytime.
All right. Well, again, this is Mornings, or should I say Mornings without Carmen, because she is out this week. She'll be back next Monday. I'm Paul, usually the producer, filling in this week. And, more to come. And again, be sure as you're looking at these issues, pray the news always. Pray the news. And be open to living in that tension. Hey, if you're new to Faith Radio, maybe this is the first time you're listening, and again, I'm not the normal guy here, that's Carmen, but we'd love to tell you more about us. So if you would, text the word WELCOME to 877-933-2484. We'll send you out a Faith Radio welcome pack, introducing ourselves, and then, again, just welcoming you to the Faith Radio family. More with Mornings Without Carmen. Straight ahead, Linda Mintle will be joining us in just a bit, and talking about grudges. Are you holding any? How do you let go? Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mornings with Carmen LaBerge. Podcasts like this are available because of your support. If it's important to you to hear things that encourage your faith, click the link in the show notes to give now. And thanks.